The platform lights flicked from green to red exactly 30 seconds too late. Vivian Calder watched the last train to Manhattan pull away, its taillight shrinking into the dark. Her phone was dead. The town's only cab company had stopped answering. The single hotel on Warren Street had a plywood sign nailed over its entrance, closed for renovation. Across the tracks, a man in a canvas jacket was locking a woodworking shop, keys jangling in the cold. He looked at her once, the way a person looks at someone clearly stranded, and crossed the street without hurrying. He didn't ask her name. "You can stay at my place tonight," he said. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A stranger, a dark street, an offer with no small print attached. But Hudson at 11 at night did not offer a second option, and something about the way he said it, plain and unbothered, made it sound less like an invitation and more like a fact he was stating for her convenience. He introduced himself as Ezra Larkin, gestured toward the low house behind the shop, and started walking without waiting to see if she'd follow. She glanced once at the empty tracks, at the dark platform, at the phone in her hand that could no longer call anyone even if she wanted to, and found that the choice had already made itself. She followed him across 30 yards of frost-stiffened grass, past a porch light with a moth's inside smelled like pine shavings and something baked that had gone a little too long in the oven. It was not the smell of any building Vivian had been inside in a decade. Her offices smelled like recycled air and coffee that cost $9 a cup, poured by a barista who called her by her title instead of her name. This smelled like a kitchen someone actually used, cluttered in the particular way that meant nobody was performing tidiness for a guest, because nobody had expected one. "Sorry about the mess," Ezra said, though there wasn't much of one, just a table with a half-finished chair leg on it and a stack of unopened mail. He cleared the chair leg into a corner like it embarrassed him, the way a man clears evidence of a hobby he doesn't quite believe is worth explaining. "It's not much, but it's warm," and the couch pulls out. A door down the hall opened before he finished the sentence. A girl of about 8 stood in the gap in flannel pajamas, hair mussed from a pillow, studying Vivian with the frank, unfiltered curiosity only children still allow themselves, the kind adults spend years training out of one another. "Are you the lady from TV?" she asked, without preamble. "No," Vivian said, caught off guard into something like a smile, the first real one she'd allowed herself all day. "Just a lady who missed her train." "That's still kind of exciting," the girl decided, entirely unbothered by the correction, and introduced herself as Josie before her father could shoo her back to bed, which he did gently, a hand on her shoulder, guiding her down the hall while she twisted around twice to look back at their guest, as if committing the shape of a stranger in her father's kitchen to memory. Ezra set a kettle on the stove and moved around the kitchen with the unbothered economy of a man who'd done this exact sequence of motions 1,000 times before, mug down, water on, being bread into the toaster, without needing to look. He didn't ask her the questions a stranger usually asked, in a situation like this, what she did, where she was from, whether someone was worried about her. He simply let her sit at his table and be tired, which she found, to her own mild surprise, was exactly what she needed and hadn't known how to ask for. Ezra apologized again for the couch, for the lack of a proper guest room, for a town that didn't run late enough to get her home. Vivian told him it was fine, and meant it more than she expected to. She sat at the small kitchen table while he heated the kettle, and for the first time in longer than she could place, she ate dinner buttered toast, an apple cut into quarters, nothing that came from a restaurant with her name on the reservation list, in a kitchen that belonged to no one but the people who lived in it. There was no host trying to impress her, no assistant hovering to anticipate her next request. There was only a man who moved around his own kitchen without thinking about it, and a stranger sitting at his table because the alternative had been a cold platform bench. She was wary of the ease of it, the way she was wary of anything that felt good without her having earned it first. She let herself feel it anyway, just for the length of 1 cup of tea, before she told herself she'd be gone by morning, and none of this would matter. Morning came early and gray, light slanting through a window that needed caulking. Vivian woke on the pulled-out couch to the sound of a hand plane sliding over wood somewhere close, rhythmic and unhurried, the kind of sound that seemed to belong to a slower century than the one she usually lived in. She found the noise coming from a small side room off the kitchen that functioned as a home office, door left ajar. She meant only to look for coffee. Instead, she stopped in the doorway, one hand still braced against the frame, pinned to a corkboard above the desk. Half covered by newer sketches of table legs and drawer joints, was a technical drawing not decorative, not a woodworker's flourish, but a structural load diagram, dense with calculations, annotated in a hand she recognized because she had been staring at variations of it for 3 weeks straight. It was the Hudson Depot, the same building her fund was underwriting, the same roof trusses her own engineers had flagged for a second look before the board's final vote. "You draw load diagrams for fun?" she asked, when Ezra appeared behind her with 2 mugs of coffee, and she watched something in his face close like a shutter dropping over a window that had briefly been left open. He handed her the coffee before he answered, which she would later understand was a habit of his buying himself a second to decide how much truth a given moment could hold without breaking something. "Used to be a structural engineer," he said. "Cornell, then a firm downstate. Long time ago. Before things fell apart." "Fell apart how?" "That's a longer story than we have time for before your car service gets here." He said it lightly, a door shutting without slamming, and turned to top off his own mug though it was still nearly full, the gesture buying him distance more than caffeine. He moved a stack of newer sketches over the corkboard as he passed it, not quite hiding the drawing underneath but not leaving it in plain sight either. A small, almost unconscious act of tidying that told her more than the sentence he'd just given her. She didn't press. She had learned, in boardrooms full of men who deflected with far less grace than he'd just managed, exactly what a redirect like that meant and exactly how little good it did to force the issue before someone was ready to open it on their own terms. But the curiosity didn't leave her. It sat in her chest the rest of the morning, through the eggs Ezra made without asking if she wanted any, through Josie appearing in the kitchen already dressed for school, sliding into the chair beside Vivian like she'd known her for years instead of 12 hours. "My dad used to build big buildings," Josie announced, matter of fact, mouth full of toast, entirely unaware of the weight of what she was handing over. "Now he just makes chairs." "Josie," Ezra said, not sharp, just a name spoken as a small break, the kind of correction a father gives out of habit rather than real objection. "What?" "It's true." She shrugged and went back to her breakfast, unaware she'd just handed Vivian the loose thread of an entire hidden life, wound tight and tucked away behind a corkboard of sketches nobody was meant to notice. The car that finally came for Vivian arrived at 9. Ezra walked her to the porch, hands in his pockets, and told her to get home safe like it was the most ordinary sentence in the world, one he might say to anyone leaving his house on any given Tuesday. She thanked him for the couch, the toast, the inconvenience she'd caused without meaning to, and he waved it off with the same ease he'd offered his house the night before, as if hospitality cost him nothing, and he'd never once considered it might. She got into the car and did not look back at the window, though she wanted to, and spent the whole ride to the station turning over one thought that refused to settle. A man who built chairs for a living did not sketch structural load calculations in his spare time, and certainly not with that much precision. Back in the city, the name found her before she went looking for it. She was 3 hours into catching up on the Hudson Depot file email backlog, engineers' reports, and the endless paper trail that came with underwriting a restoration this size, when she flipped past an old inspection summary that predated her fund's involvement by years. A line item near the bottom, crossed out in a previous draft but not fully deleted, read, "Larkin and Pierce structural engineering findings disputed. Contract terminated." Vivian sat back in her chair. It could be nothing. Larkin was not an uncommon name, but she had learned, over more than a decade of due diligence, that coincidences in a paper trail were rarer than most people liked to believe, and that the ones that mattered had a way of resurfacing exactly when you'd stopped looking for them. She asked her assistant, casually, if anyone remembered a firm called Larkin and Pierce. The answer came back thin and careful, something about a bridge inspection scandal, 6 or 7 years back, upstate, a firm that got quietly dropped from every approved vendor list in the region afterward. No one wanted to say more than that. It had the shape of a story people preferred to let stay buried, the kind that made everyone in a room suddenly very interested in their own paperwork. That afternoon, in a committee meeting about an unrelated infrastructure bond, Desmond Pierce, the firm's longtime investment chair, a man Vivian had always found competent and mildly insufferable in roughly equal measure, made an offhand comment about risk exposure and, without apparent thought, added, "We saw where that kind of shortcut got the Larkins." He said it with the particular contempt of a man discarding a name he considered beneath further discussion, then moved on to the next line item like nothing at all had happened, like the words had cost him nothing to say. Vivian said nothing in response. She wrote the name in the margin of her notes and underlined it twice, hard enough that the pen nearly tore the page. She told her team she wanted to revisit the Hudson site before the board vote another look at the load-bearing assessment. She said, standard diligence for a project of this size. It wasn't entirely a lie, but she knew, riding north on a weekday afternoon instead of sending a junior analyst to handle it for her, that the load-bearing assessment was not the real reason she'd booked a seat on that train. She called ahead. Not the depot office Ezra's number, which Josie had written on a napkin in careful 8-year-old handwriting and pressed into her hand at the door, insisting she might need it in case of another train emergency. Ezra picked up on the third ring, sounding surprised, then something warmer than surprised. They talked longer than the reason for the call justified about the depot, about Josie's spelling test, about nothing consequential at all, and somewhere in the middle of it Josie grabbed the phone away entirely to report, at length, and with great seriousness, that the cardboard station model had been damaged in what she called a minor incident and would need repairs before Vivian's next visit. Vivian found herself standing in her office long after the call had ended, still holding the phone, unsure exactly when a routine site visit had turned into something she was actually looking forward to. She arrived in Hudson on a Thursday evening, and this time Ezra didn't offer her the couch out of necessity. He offered her dinner because he wanted her to stay for it, and said so plainly, without the apologies that had softened every sentence the first night. The depot's structural report sat forgotten on the counter, while Josie dragged out a half-built cardboard model of the train station, her school project, glue-stiff and lopsided, and insisted Vivian help place the tiny paper passengers along the platform. "This one's you," Josie said, pressing a scrap of cardstock into Vivian's palm, a stick figure in a hastily drawn coat. "Missing her train again. I resent that," Vivian said, and Ezra laughed from the stove, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard from him before, and for a moment the three of them existed in something that felt less like a business trip and more like a Thursday any family might have, unremarkable and warm in exactly the way her calendar never allowed for. Josie assigned herself the role of station master and Vivian the role of a passenger perpetually running late, and made Ezra play 3 different conductors in a row, each with a worse mustache drawn on in washable marker than the one before. Vivian found herself laughing harder than the joke deserved, laughing the way she hadn't in longer than she wanted to think about, at a cardboard model of a building whose real version she would be voting on funding for within the month. It struck her, briefly, how strange that was a project that lived in her office, as a spreadsheet of risk percentages lived in this kitchen, as a game with a paper conductor, and a little girl's careful, uneven scissor work. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just kept playing until Josie declared the station officially closed for the night. Later, after Josie had been sent to bed under mild protest, Ezra told her not all of it, just enough about his wife. A slow illness, 3 years gone now, it's the kind of loss that didn't announce itself with drama, but simply hollowed a house out room by room until he'd had to decide whether to keep living in the noise of the city or come somewhere quiet enough to breathe again. Hudson had been quiet enough. The depot work had come later, almost by accident, a way to use his hands instead of his old calculations, on a building that didn't ask anything of him except patience, and did not once make him prove himself. Vivian, in turn, told him things she didn't usually say out loud, not even to the people paid to listen, what it cost to run a fund at 37, with a board that watched every misstep like it was evidence, how rarely anyone asked her a question that wasn't secretly a test of her competence, how long it had been since a conversation had gone anywhere she hadn't already mapped out in advance. She told him about the year she'd taken over the fund, 29 years old and the only woman in a room of men who'd built their careers on outlasting people exactly like her, and how she'd learned to speak in numbers because numbers didn't get interrupted the way opinions did. Ezra listened without offering advice, which she noticed and was grateful for, because advice was the one thing she got more of than she needed. She wasn't performing for him, and she noticed that, distinctly, The way you noticed the absence of a headache you'd stopped realizing you were carrying every single day. Neither of them named what was happening between them across that kitchen table. But by the time she left for the guest room, an actual guest room this time, made up with fresh sheets, Josie's doing, she suspected, and from the uneven hospital corners, both of them understood something had shifted since the platform 3 weeks earlier, and neither was in any hurry to say so out loud. The committee meeting the following Tuesday started calmly enough, and did not stay that way for long. Desmond Pierce opened with a presentation Vivian hadn't seen in advance, built around a set of structural risk projections for the Hudson Depot that read, to her practiced eye, like numbers reverse-engineered to justify a conclusion someone had already reached, rather than numbers honestly arrived at. He argued, with real force, that the restoration carried unacceptable structural liability, and recommended the fund withdraw its financing before the next scheduled disbursement. Vivian pushed back with the data her own engineers had produced: sound numbers, no red flags, a building in better condition than half the fund's other holdings put together. Pierce dismissed it with a confidence that struck her as slightly too immediate, too rehearsed, as though he'd anticipated resistance and prepared for it well in advance, rather than being persuaded of anything in the room in real time. 2 other committee members sided with Pierce before Vivian had finished her second point, quoting his risk figures back at her as though they'd already settled the matter privately before the meeting began. It was a pattern she recognized from a decade of these rooms, a decision made somewhere off the record, then walked into the meeting dressed up as an open discussion. She let it go for the moment, agreed to revisit the figures before the next scheduled vote, and watched Pierce accept the delay with a satisfaction he didn't bother to fully hide, the satisfaction of a man who believed a few weeks would be more than enough time for a project like Hudson's to quietly die on its own. She couldn't say why it unsettled her the way it did, only that it did. That evening she had legal pull, every archive document connected to the old Larkin and Pierce firm contracts, inspection files, the full record of the Ashcombe Bridge incident that had ended the company 7 years earlier. Most of it read exactly as the public record suggested, a firm undone by its own negligence. But procedural files rarely told the whole story, and Vivian had spent her career learning to read the parts of a file that existed only because someone had forgotten to remove them. Buried in a footnote of an old procedural file was a name she hadn't seen before: Marion Doyle, listed as the depot's records clerk at the time of the original inspection, the one person still living on record who had worked directly alongside the inspection team. Vivian told her legal department she'd handle the follow-up herself, and didn't explain why. Vivian read through the Ashcombe file twice that night, long after her assistant had gone home, and found the same pattern repeating in a dozen small ways: dates that didn't quite line up, and a final inspection sign-off filed 9 days after the report claimed the site visit had occurred, a paper trail that had clearly been assembled to look complete rather than to actually be complete. None of it proved anything on its own. Together, it read like a building someone had constructed on purpose. It's the way a false wall gets framed to look load-bearing when it isn't holding anything up at all. Marion Doyle's house sat at the edge of town, paint peeling at the corners, a wind chime clattering on the porch in a wind that hadn't reached the street yet. Vivian knocked twice before the door opened 4 inches on a chain, one wary eye visible in the gap, taking her in from shoes to collar in under a second. "I don't talk to anyone from Calder Bridge," Marion said, and shut the door hard enough to rattle the chime against the frame. Vivian stood on the step a long moment, then left a card wedged in the doorframe and walked back to her car, certain the trip had been wasted entirely. She was 3 streets away when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. "Come back," Marion said, voice tight, almost a whisper. "Alone. And don't tell anyone at your office you're here." The house was warmer than its outside suggested, cluttered with the accumulated evidence of 30 years spent in one place. Marion's hands shook slightly as she poured coffee neither of them touched. She'd worked the Hudson Depot inspection files back when Larkin and Pierce still held the county contract, she explained, and she'd been afraid, every day since, of what would happen if the wrong person ever asked her the right question at the wrong time. "Desmond Pierce paid me," she said flatly, no longer bothering to soften it. "Called it a consulting stipend. No paperwork behind it. just enough every year to make sure I kept quiet about what I saw before the Ashcombe report ever went out the door. She rose, unlocked a drawer in an old roll-top desk, with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck, and set a folder on the table between them, her fingers lingering on it a moment before she let go. Inside was the original inspection report from 2019, not the version filed publicly, but the working draft, complete with a signature at the bottom that had been altered. A load-bearing figure changed by hand after the fact to make a failing structure read as passing. Beneath it, in a different, more careful hand, was a second document, a warning memo, handwritten, dated weeks before the final filing, flagging the exact defect the falsified figure had later concealed. The signature at the bottom of the memo was Ezra's. He tried to stop it, Marion said. Wrote that memo, took it straight to Pierce himself. Pierce buried it, forged the sign-off under Ezra's name on the final report instead, and when the bridge scandal broke wide open, made sure every ounce of blame landed on the Larkin name and nowhere near his own. Vivian sat with the papers in front of her for a long moment, feeling something recalibrate quietly in her chest, not just the shape of the case against Pierce, but the shape of the man she'd been slowly, carefully starting to trust, without quite admitting it to herself. He hadn't caused the disaster that had cost him everything he'd built. He had been the only person in that entire firm who had tried in writing to prevent it. She thought of the kitchen table, the toast, the cardboard model with its paper conductors, all of it sitting now beside the memory of a man who had watched his father's company collapse under a lie, and never once, in a year of knowing him, let it curdle into bitterness she could see. She thanked Marion, promised her nothing except that she'd be careful with what she'd been given, and drove back toward Ezra's house with the folder on the passenger seat, her hands tighter on the wheel than the empty road actually required of her. Ezra was in the workshop when she arrived, sanding a table edge under a single hanging bulb, sawdust caught in the light, like slow snow. He looked up, read something in her face before she said a single word, and set the sandpaper down slowly, like a man bracing for a door he'd been half expecting to open again for 6 long years. She placed the folder on the workbench, instead of accusing him of anything. "I'm not here to ask if it's true," she said. "I already know it is. I want to hear the rest of it from you, not from a file." So he told her, all of it. This time how he'd caught the load-bearing miscalculation weeks before the Ashcombe report went final. How he'd written the memo and walked it into Pierce's office himself, certain that doing the right thing in writing would simply be enough to matter. How Pierce had smiled, thanked him for his diligence, and then quietly rewritten the record to make Ezra the one who'd signed off on the failure instead. How the firm had fired him within the month to distance itself from the fallout. How his father, the firm's founder, proud of nothing so much as the name on the door, had watched the company he'd spent 30 years building collapse under an accusation his own son had never earned, and hadn't lived long enough afterward to see the record corrected. Ezra's license had been suspended pending review for 2 years, before quietly lapsing into something he'd simply stopped fighting for, because by then there had been nothing left worth renewing it for. He told her about the 2 years afterward, too, the license review that dragged on with no real timeline, the calls to old colleagues that went unreturned once his name got attached to a scandal nobody wanted to be seen asking questions about, the slow realization that rebuilding a career meant fighting people with more resources and more patience than he had left to spend. He'd stopped fighting, he admitted, not because he no longer believed he was right, but because being right hadn't once mattered more than Pierce's version of events, and he'd needed, eventually, to build a life that didn't depend on anyone believing him. "I never thought the person who'd finally bring the truth out into the open," he said, "would be the one holding the checkbook for the building I've spent a year trying to save." In the kitchen doorway, unnoticed until she spoke, Josie stood in her socks, having heard enough of the tone if not the words to understand that something heavy was happening in the next room. She didn't ask any questions. She crossed the floor and wrapped both arms around her father's waist, the way children do when they sense a parent needs steadying more than explaining. And Ezra's hand came down automatically to rest on her hair, his voice catching once before he found it again and kept going. Vivian watched them and made a decision she didn't need to say out loud right away. "I'm taking this to the committee," she told him instead. "All of it. Every page. I know what that means for Pierce. I know what it might cost me personally to be the one who brings it. I'm doing it anyway. The boardroom on the following Friday held every member of the investment committee, plus 2 compliance officers Vivian had asked to attend without giving Pierce any advance warning as to why. She had rehearsed the presentation twice the night before, alone in her apartment, not because she doubted the evidence, but because she understood exactly how much would ride on the order she chose to lay it out in. She laid it out in order, page by page: the falsified inspection report from 2019, Marion's sworn statement, the altered signature line an independent forensic document examiner had confirmed was manipulated after the fact, and Ezra's original handwritten memo, the ink now 7 years old, the warning it contained having gone unheeded for exactly as long as Pierce had needed it to stay buried. Pierce came out swinging, questioning Marion's credibility, calling the memo unverifiable, insisting the entire narrative was a fabrication built to justify Vivian's personal attachment to a restoration project she'd grown, in his words, irrationally invested in. He raised his voice for the first time in the meeting, reminded the room of his 15 years on the committee, of every deal he'd steered safely to close, as though tenure alone could outweigh a forged signature sitting in a folder on the table in front of everyone. It might have worked 6 months earlier, on a board less willing to look closely at its own history, but the forensic signature examiner, brought in independently at Vivian's request and unknown to anyone else in the room, laid out the analysis in plain terms. Even a non-engineer could follow the pressure variance in the pen strokes, the ink composition inconsistent with the report's stated filing date, the load-bearing figure altered after the original had already dried. It was not something a raised voice could argue away. One by one, the doubtful faces around the table turned from Pierce toward the papers laid out in front of them instead, and stayed there, and nobody turned back toward him again for the rest of the meeting. The vote came down 7-2. Pierce sat very still while the tally was read aloud, the confidence gone from his face entirely, replaced by something closer to arithmetic, a man calculating, too late, exactly how thoroughly the ground beneath him had already shifted before he'd walked into the room. He was suspended from the investment committee effective immediately, his file forwarded to compliance for a formal fraud referral, and the Hudson Depot restoration approved for full funding with a new clause, added at Vivian's insistence, naming Ezra Larkin as the project's engineer of record, his original credentials to be reinstated pending an expedited review. The board itself would now formally advocate for. Vivian didn't wait for the official memo to go out through the usual channels. She called Ezra from the hallway outside the boardroom, before the ink was even dry on the vote, and told him herself, her voice unsteady in a way it almost never was in that building. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the house with a law firm's return address. Ezra hadn't seen in 7 years his father's old attorney, retired now but not forgotten, writing to confirm that the state licensing board had formally reinstated Ezra's structural engineering credentials. The original suspension vacated and expunged from the record entirely. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table before he let himself believe it was real, then a third time out loud to Josie, who didn't fully understand what a license was but understood, from the way her father's voice sounded, that it mattered enormously to him. Word moved through Hudson the way it does in small towns, not all at once, but steadily, until the man everyone had known simply as the fellow fixing up the old depot became, in the town's slow retelling of it, the engineer who had tried to stop a bridge from failing 7 years before anyone thought to thank him for the attempt. Ezra didn't go looking for the recognition. He didn't need the whole town's understanding to know what he had and hadn't done. What mattered to him was simpler than that he was back where he belonged, doing honest work under his own name for the first time in longer than he wanted to sit down and count. Even so, when the hardware store owner shook his hand a little longer than usual one morning, or when the school principal mentioned, almost shyly, that Josie's class had asked to tour the depot once the scaffolding came down, he let himself feel it, quietly, the way a man allows himself one good thing, after a long stretch of getting by on none. Vivian came up that weekend, without a single reason tied to any report or any board deadline. Josie spotted her car before it had fully stopped rolling and ran out barefoot across the gravel, pulling her by the hand toward the depot before Vivian had even had the chance to say hello to Ezra properly. "Come see Dad's new drawings," Josie said, breathless, tugging her past the scaffolding toward the site office, where fresh blueprints signed this time, with Ezra's full credentials restored beside his name, were pinned in a neat row across an entire wall. Ezra stood in the doorway watching the two of them, something loosening in his chest that he hadn't planned for and didn't try very hard to name. When Vivian finally looked over at him, there was nothing left to explain between them, no report to justify the visit, no pretense of due diligence, standing in for the plainer truth of why she kept coming back to this small town on a train she no longer needed an excuse to take. They stood together on the platform as the evening light slanted low across the half-restored roof trusses above them, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment. They didn't need to. Both of them understood, in the particular quiet shared by two people who no longer had to perform certainty for each other, that a missed train on an ordinary Tuesday had somehow rerouted the rest of both their lives without either one noticing exactly when it happened. The depot reopened the following spring, its restored facade lit gold under strings of temporary bulbs strung for the ceremony, the platform crowded with townspeople who had watched the building slowly come back to life over the better part of a year. A brass plaque near the entrance listed the project's engineer of record in plain lettering, Ezra Larkin. He stood beside it for a photograph he hadn't wanted, and Josie had insisted on, tugging at his sleeve until he finally agreed just to make her stop. Vivian stood at the edge of the crowd, not on the small stage set up for the ribbon cutting, not introduced as the fund's chief executive, though at least half the room knew exactly who she was and what she'd risked to get the building this far. A reporter from the county paper had asked her earlier, gently probing, what exactly her fund's interest was in a project this modest, this far outside its usual scale, and she'd answered honestly without offering the full truth of it that some investments repaid themselves in ways a quarterly report was never built to measure. She stood with Josie's hand in hers instead of near the podium, the girl leaning her whole weight against Vivian's side, entirely unbothered by the distinction between guest and family that the adults around her seemed to find so complicated to name out loud. Somewhere behind them, the old platform clock, restored along with everything else, ticked toward 9:47 with a steadiness it hadn't kept in years. When Ezra stepped down from the platform after his brief remarks, he didn't look for the mayor or the reporter from the county paper or any of the officials waiting patiently to shake his hand and have their photograph taken beside him. He looked for Vivian first, found her exactly where he expected her to be standing, and crossed the platform toward her without hurrying, carrying the same unhurried certainty he'd carried across a dark street a year earlier when neither of them had known yet what one offered night would turn into. Josie let go of Vivian's hand only when her father reached them, and even then didn't go far, satisfied to stand between the two of them with the easy possession of a child who had decided, long before either adult had said anything out loud, exactly how this was supposed to end. At 9:47 that evening, the last train of the night pulled out of Hudson Station on schedule, its windows lit gold against the dark, exactly as it had a year before to the day. This time, Vivian stood on the platform and watched it go without her, and made no move at all to run for it. She had come to Hudson once to catch a train. She stayed, in the end, because somewhere in the space of one missed departure and everything after it, she had found a home instead.